Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of the conference. I'm Joan Sawalczyk, and I teach women and gender studies here at UTM and actually in this classroom. So it's very familiar, but nice to see different faces. We have our first speaker, Scott Frickel, and both speakers are going to engage us in a way that leads to possibility. We're very lucky to have Scott Frickel here with us. Scott Frickel is professor of sociology. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before coming to Brown, he held faculty appointments at Tulane and Washington State, where he was the Boeing District Professor of Environmental Sociology. His research and teaching include center on the intersections of nature, knowledge, and politics. And the title of his talk today is Sights Unseen, Uncovering Hidden Hazards and Hidden Lessons for Sustainable Urban Future. So welcome.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak with you, and I will try to follow on the very high quality talks we saw yesterday as well. I'm not sure how hopeful I'm going to end up being. I guess that's for you to judge. But I think what I have to say is important as we think about sort of sustainability and a sustainable future. So to start, sustainable societies of the future will require sustainable cities. And I think that much goes without saying. Today, I'm going to argue that for cities to be sustainable, we need to pay attention to their past as much as to their present and future. And we need to strive for a deeper understanding of the ongoing historical nature of urban environmental change, because cities are dynamic systems that are remaking themselves all the time. And we need to understand how that happens and why. I'm also going to argue that before we can use history to build more resilient, more community-minded, more just cities, we need to find it. Specifically, we need to excavate the history of urban environmental change and make that history legible to communities and to urban planners and policymakers. So for the last decade or so, my colleague Jim Elliott and I have worked to do this in a sort of a specific way, focusing on the historical patterns of industrial land use in 4 American cities over the past 6 decades, from around 1956 to 2008, when we stopped collecting data. We published the study last year in this book that you see on the screen, and today I want to describe a little bit about what we did and summarize some of what we found. Since arriving at Brown University about 5 years ago, I've also worked with a sociology PhD student, Tom Marlowe, to deepen, extend, and refine our data collection approach and apply that to Rhode Island and Providence, Rhode Island, where we live now, expanding our focus using computational techniques from cities to states and from a subset of hazardous industrial sectors that I'll talk about today to all manufacturing. And so towards the end of my talk today, I'll show you some of what we're finding in this newer study. So we're interested in the industrialization of urban lands as a basic type of urban environmental change. And I want to say, or just sort of pause for a moment and say that in the context of climate change, it seems to me that land-based industrial waste has sort of moved off of center stage of our attention, which is all focused on atmospheric and carbon emissions. But the synthesis of carbon, rather than the combustion of carbon, is in the chemical toxins that envelop our biosphere are the other side of the climate change coin. And so I want to try to draw our attention back, at least partially, to this question of toxins and environmental health, which will be with us as the climate changes and whose impacts most likely will become more intense and more severe with those changes. So why focus on hazardous releases and why focus on hazardous releases to land? This slide here shows an image from a 2011 Environmental Protection Agency report reporting toxic release inventory data for deposition of industrial waste to in various modes. And you can see from this slide that on-site deposition or releases of industrial waste to land is far greater than the other kinds of sites. And in fact, comparing the green column to the blue column, that you can see that between 2010 and 2011, that volume is actually increased. And it's sort of, there's some studies to suggest that over time, in the past several decades, as federal regulations in the United States have consolidated around air and water quality regulations, waste disposal to land has increased because it's got to go somewhere, right? So if it can't go into our waters and it can't go into the air, it ends up in the land. So these toxins accumulate in the soil. If these sites are not remediated, they can stay there and last for generations. But I also want to point out that the data that this slide is based on, the toxic release inventory data that the government has been collecting since the late 1980s, is very limited in ways that most people don't often recognize. Facilities are required to report to this agency and file these toxic release inventory reports only if they fall into all three categories. They need to be in designated industrial sectors. So there are some sectors, industrial sectors, that are wholly exempt from these reporting requirements. The facilities need to be employ 10 or more full-time employees on an annual basis, and they need to be releasing 25,000 pounds or more of contaminants in order to sort of qualify for these reporting requirements. They're also, since the late 1990s, these reporting requirements have been voluntary with deregulation. And there are penalties for not reporting, but there's big questions about how much those regulations, reporting requirements, are actually enforced. Even so, there are not dozens, but hundreds and possibly thousands of studies, published studies, that rely on these data, many of them focused on statistical analyses of environmental inequality of one sort or another. And it's sort of that question and that sort of tradition of using TRI data to think about waste and to think about its impact on low-income communities and communities of color that we've sort of used to frame this study. Most of those analyses start with the TRI data, and they focus on known hazardous sites that have reported various sorts of waste, high volumes of waste. And then those studies try to look and see who lives nearby, and that's their analysis. A smaller group of studies begin the same way with these known sites of hazardous releases, and then try to trace back the historical relationship between that community and the siting of that particular facility. And they ask questions about whether the facility was sited before the community became poor, or whether there was a poor community that then allowed a polluting facility to establish itself. But both of these processes, or both of these sort of approaches, are kind of selecting on the dependent variable. They're selecting on known sites that we know about and understand as hazardous because they appear in these government databases. But as I said before, those government databases are very limited. They miss all of the sites that were historically existing and active, many of which closed down before the late 1980s, when toxic release inventory data began to be collected. So our approach is trying to regain some of that history, to sort of start from a different point and ask, historically, where were industrial facilities located? What did they do? Who did they employ? Where did they exist? And when did they close down? And then use that new kind of database to sort of help us understand the relationship between neighborhood change and environmental pollution or contamination. So our model, and I'm not going to spend more than just 2 minutes on this, is we call it socio-environmental succession. It involves three basic components: industrial churning, which is simply the movement, the spatial movement and temporal movement of industrial facilities or industrialized land over time as businesses and manufacturing facilities open, operate for some period of time, close down, other ones come in and take their place. That's industrial churning. Residential churning is the same idea. It's super intuitive. Communities change in racial and ethnic composition and change in terms of income composition over time at the individual and family level, of course, but also at the group level. So we can measure sort of group-wise neighborhood compositional change over time using census data. And those two processes are interlinked in this model because they're ongoing, they're interrelated, and they're occurring simultaneously in cities. It's very much a part of the basic nature of urban places, is this sort of demographic and industrial dynamism that we're trying to capture and think about. And the third piece of our model, what we call risk containment, is a political process grounded in regulatory regimes and regulatory oversight and practice. And we argue that risk containment is a way of managing the public perception of risk by focusing on a handful of heavily polluting, obviously risky kinds of sites, but ignoring all the rest that has come before and it's just missing from government databases and websites. So this study is a comparative project. We focus on these socio-environmental succession in 4 cities: Minneapolis, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Portland, Oregon. 4 cities in very different parts of the country, all of them resting alongside a major river, all with histories of industrial development, but with there are different sizes. Importantly, they have different racial and ethnic compositions. New Orleans and Philadelphia are majority African-American cities. Portland is the whitest large city in the United States. So there's real difference in racial and ethnic composition there as well. We undertook a sort of multi-step data collection approach that begins with, sort of ironically, based on what I've said, begins with the TRI databases. And we use the reported volumes of, historically reported volumes in TRI databases to identify what are the most hazardous industrial sectors operating in these 4 cities. Perhaps not surprisingly, maybe surprisingly, those are the 7, the sectors that you see listed were the 7 that rose to the top in all 4 cities, which was surprising to us because we were imagining we'd see variation there, but we did not. Then we, with those sectors selected, then we took and tracked down historical manufacturing directories that in the United States, I don't know if they have comparable directories in Canada, but in the United States, these directories were produced beginning in the mid-1950s in most states. And they document all of the industrial activities that was going on in a state for a particular year. They're published roughly biannually. And so we tracked these down, found them, hired a small army of undergraduate students to manually go through these page by page by page and entering all the data for every facility in that directory for those 4 cities in those 7 sectors. So we got data on street address, number of employees, oftentimes when the site or when the facility began operation. And then we can tell when the address disappears from the manufacturing directories is when they close down, right? So we can track their closure as well. We merge that with census tract data to bring demographic change into the equation, to sort of model how neighborhoods and industrial facilities are changing in relation to one another over time. For a second part of the analysis, we then, Jim and I traveled to these 4 cities. We randomly sampled 100 of these historic sites in our database and drove to them, found them, and documented the kinds of uses, the kind of land uses that was happening on those parcels today or currently, contemporaneously. And then finally, we tracked down municipal, state, and federal hazardous site lists and information from government regulatory agencies so that we could compare what regulatory agencies have on their radar screen compared to our database of historically existing manufacturing sites. So one thing I want to point out here is that our focus is not on firms, but it's on parcels of land. So it's the site that we're interested in, not the company that's operating on top of that land. We don't really know what's in the land. I think that it's important to point out that the sort of Achilles heel of our project is that we don't have any data on soil quality. We're making assumptions general assumptions that manufacturing is hazardous, much of it, and some of that hazardous material ends up on site. But I will be the first to admit that we don't actually have real data on that, other than the data that the regulatory agencies have collected that match our database. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. There is a study that we like to point to, though, from the early 90s that tried to predict the likelihood that industrial activities in these certain sectors produce on-site contamination. As you can see from the figures that Noonan and Vidic developed, the probabilities are quite high in the sort of sectors that we are focused on. So let me say a little bit about hazardous industrial churning. This is data that will show all 4 cities aggregated together by the size of number of employees. And so that you can see that over time, large facilities with 100 or more employees stay about the same over time. There's not a lot of change, and there's not a lot of them. By definition, very large facilities are few and far between, but they're a consistent pattern over time. Medium-sized facilities that employ between 10 and 99 people. Again, there are more of these. There are about fewer than 100 in these cities over the span of time that we're studying. But importantly, that line is relatively flat, even through a period of heavy industrialization, which is usually measured by number of employees, not number of firms. And so I think that's important to recognize as well. One of the things that we're tracking here in this study, although it wasn't the focus of our analysis, was that deindustrialization in these 4 cities at least seems to have involved not fewer facilities, but fewer workers. So they were downsizing, and that's how deindustrialization was occurring for most of this. Now, just FYI, this sort of group of firms or sites would be ones that would be targeted for regulation under existing federal laws in the United States. That doesn't include the smaller facilities that are waived from any reporting requirements. Again, the line that you see is from year to year is relatively flat, although there's a slight decrease from 1970 on. The real increase that we show here, though, is the accumulation of relic sites, that is, the sites that close down, continues to increase over time rather than stay flat. And what that's telling us is that the accumulation of these sites is not just a temporal process, but also a spatial process. That is, the sites are accumulating over time because the sites are moving. Hazardous industrial work activities are not relocating on top of former hazardous industrial sites. They're locating somewhere else. And so space-wise, spatially, The footprint of industrialized land across all these 4 cities is increasing quite a bit over time. And it's inexorable, and it's a relentless form of accumulation of toxins, if we want to think about it that way. Here is a spatial view of that same data. These are density kernel maps, and you can see that in all 4 cities, there are these very dark patches of historically concentrated industrial activity, and every city has these industrial areas that have been industrialized for decades, that remain industrialized, that are zoned for industrial activity. And so you can see that, but I also want to draw your attention to the fuzzy gray areas, which shows the diffusion of industrial activity outside of those zoned areas, historically zoned for industrial activity. One of the sort of points that our work seems to highlight is that zoning, as a matter of municipal practice, does a good job of keeping residents out of these heavily industrialized zones. It doesn't do a good job of keeping industry out of residential areas. It doesn't work both ways. And so that's something to keep in mind as we learn more about the nature of industrial churning and what that's doing to urban landscapes. So residential churning, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this. As I said before, it's a very intuitive kind of concept. We developed an index of cumulative change to sort of map group-wise demographic changes in census tracts, averaged across census tracts. This shows churning by race in terms of it's measured as percent white. And what it's basically showing is that from decade to decade, on average, census tracts in all 4 cities are experiencing cumulative levels of measurable change in the percent white in those census tracts. And this is true for most census tracts in these 4 cities. The rates of change vary a bit. It's steeper, the curves are steeper for Philadelphia and New Orleans, which are the majority African-American cities. It's least steep for Portland, which, as I said before, is a predominantly white city, but it's happening everywhere. In fact, the only census tracts that aren't dynamic in this group-wise change, are the wealthiest neighborhoods. The very wealthy neighborhoods are very stable racially and ethnically, as are the very poorest neighborhoods. Those kinds of neighborhoods are not churning, but everything in the middle is. And that's consistent over time as well. And so when you put these 2 kinds of churning together, you get different kinds of stories about about environmental inequality. And so we can track environmental inequality in terms of relict sites, the sites that have closed down, and we can track it in terms of active sites that are operating in a particular moment. I won't pay attention to the slide so much as to just simply say that, and we can talk about this more later if you want, when we narrow the focus to large industrial facilities or industrial sites in our database, our findings map exactly onto the predominant findings in the environmental inequality literature, which is that low-income and minority communities are predominantly and disproportionately impacted by those large industrial facilities. That is true, and I think because our database include more of those kinds of facilities in government databases, our work supports and affirms those findings. But when you include relic sites and when you include smaller sites and medium-sized sites, those findings change a lot in ways that are sort of too complicated to go into now, except to note, I guess I do want to note that the trend towards gentrification of urban areas is driving middle and upper income whites into older parts of American cities that are putting those groups in closer proximity to historical hazards, the legacy of older manufacturing facilities, which complicates the picture a great deal. And so that's some of what we're finding with respect to that question about inequalities and historical inequalities and legacies. What I really want to focus on in my time here is, what is it? 5? Eeks. Okay, is risk containment. So the sites are not always, the sites that we see in cities are not always what they seem. These photos are taken from all those 4 cities that I've been discussing. They all have, they're very different today. They all have one thing in common. They all have an industrial past. We don't see that with the exception of the one Superfund site up there in the corner. But these are typical looking sites that we wouldn't blink an eye at if we walked past them today. Every one of them used to have some sort of hazardous industrial activity on them. Our survey results are also interesting and sort of reaffirm the sort of nature of industrial churning and demographic mobility that's going on. So so these are the contemporary site survey data that we did when we revisited those cities. And what that shows is that most of these sites, when they get reused for something other than hazardous industrial activities, which you see in the sort of lighter blue shade on the far left of the screen. They used for lots of different things, mostly commercial, but also residential, public spaces. We found evidence of playgrounds and parks and nursery schools and preschools and grocery stores and restaurants. This is valuable urban space that gets used for whatever the buyers of that land want to use it for. So what do regulatory agency sites see when they ask these questions? To find out, as I said before, we collected data from regulatory agencies' hazardous site lists. We paired that with ours and did some sort of spatial matching programs to try to identify overlaps. And what you see on the far right column is the percentage of sites that are contained in our database that also show up on regulatory agency site lists. And Portland's Department of Environmental Management is very progressive. They're very transparent with their data. It's cumulative. They keep cumulative aggregated records. It's very easy to access. They're the best case scenario. And in Portland, 93% of historically existing hazardous facilities or sites are not on their records. And that's the best case scenario. We looked to see what sort of factors predicted whether or not a regulatory agency would pay attention to these sites. And we found that basically these are in the statistically significant factors are listed in level of importance. It's the size of the facility, it's the total years in operation, and it's how recently they went out of operation. Those are the 3 factors that matter most. When you put those all together, the largest, oldest, and most recently closed facilities together, we find that there's a 16.5% probability that those kinds of visible, old, big sites will be regulated at all. So our regulatory system isn't working, I think, would be one conclusion to draw from this. So with the few minutes that I have remaining, I want to sort of turn our attention to the new data that we're developing in Rhode Island. This is the state of Rhode Island. For those of you who don't know, it's the smallest state in the country. Providence and metropolitan Providence is the only real urban place, which you see taking shape here. What you're looking at is the results of our computational efforts to extract all manufacturing from these historical directories for the entire state. Every orange dot that appears on the screen is the location of a relic site. That is an industrial site that has ceased to operate. So when those activities operate, they become visible on our map. And what you are seeing here is the inexorable, relentless accumulation of industrialized land across not just the urban landscape, but the suburban and rural landscape as well. And so I think it's important when thinking about sustainability to remember that these processes are ongoing. They're relentless and they don't stop. Second, topography matters. Rhode Island is on the coast, on the East Coast. It's very low-lying. The highest point in Providence, I believe, is about 800 feet above sea level. And what this data graph shows is that as over time, industrial facilities have tended to site themselves, to place themselves further away from rivers, from low-lying land. But again, there's no real highland in Providence, although there are some nice hills. But at any rate, topography matters. And I think the other thing that this graph shows is that there is this over time, this increasing dispersion of sites across an area. This is for Providence. To reiterate, here too, we can see that government databases radically underreport historically existing sites. So the green dots in this map are the sites from our historical efforts to recover them. The orange dots are the known sites for the toxic release inventory that the government has established. So we need new institutions, new approaches are needed to sort of find these sites and scale up data collection, which is kind of what we've been trying to do by using computational techniques to automate data extraction. We can do this for other states now as well. And then finally, as my last slide, is that we need to think about the relationship between legacy industrial risks and contemporary climate risks, because those I think are very poorly understood. What you're seeing here in this graph is a close-in view of downtown Providence with Narragansett Bay and the Providence River down in the bottom right corner. And those little red dots are the historical sites that we've uncovered. And the colored areas are flood zone maps that the Department of Environmental Management has produced. Those maps are current. They date from 2011, and they don't involve climate change predictions as part of their mapping strategy. So the maps are wrong, and even as they're wrong, they still include 15% of our historical sites, because historically those were sited on low-lying land near rivers for transportation reasons. So we need to pay attention to these things, and I just want to try to draw attention to the importance of history for thinking about the present and the future. I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you very much. I think we have a lot of rich material to discuss and question. So we have about 15 minutes or so.
Sure. Yeah.
My question is about 16 minutes. So the TRI reporting matter for the residential turning process in your research? Like for the sites where there is a record of hazardous activity at that site, are more affluent residents avoiding those areas, or are developers avoiding it, or not?
So, well, that's a kind of a question that you have to answer on a sort of a case-by-case basis, and it varies. It depends on what kind of development is happening on the land, I think. A lot of existing literature on environmental inequality, or there's some evidence that suggests that historically, as people have become more aware of the dangers of land-based waste in the environment, environmental inequality increased. That is, people with resources who became aware of the problem either moved or stopped, used their sort of political and economic clout to sort of clean sites up or prevent sites from moving in.
There's another question.
So built into your kind of critique is an idea that regulation should happen perhaps at the point of closure, right, or at the point of production, as opposed to at the point of reuse, right? So I guess part of my question is, if the sites aren't showing up in the sort of the regulatory gaze, yeah. Is there an attempt to, or would an efficient way of doing it be to require testing at the point of turning it into residential sites?
So there is testing that happens at exactly that moment. When property is exchanged, when title of property changes, point of sale, and when there is a suspicion among the parties that there would be a cause for concern, they are supposed to do, and I think often do what they call a phase one site investigation that would bring in a testing firm to do some initial investigation. So that work happens. We don't know very much about it because it occurs, and that testing, the regulatory science that goes on, is conducted by private companies for real estate agents who are trying to sell property. And the decisions, and it supports a pretty lucrative industry, right? A testing industry that involves engineering and chemical analysis and the like. I'm quite interested in understanding that process, and actually this is the next research project that I plan to take on, which is to try to get inside that process. The point that I think I would make here is that occurs in a largely private arena of real estate transactions. Reports are generated, science is done, data is collected, reports are produced, and then those reports are given to the new owner of the property. And so, and regulatory agencies have access to those. I've explored this question a little bit in Rhode Island. They get filed in cardboard boxes and they're put in a basement room in the Department of Environmental Management. We laugh, but that is the point where real knowledge is getting produced, but it's not getting produced in a public domain, and the public doesn't have access to it by and large.
So in your figures on site reuse, it seemed like the majority of these old hazardous industrial sites that are being reused are not being reused necessarily as residential sites or public, but as other commercial sites. Yep. And so I wonder how much this is also a story about inequality in the labor market and workplace safety, because the people who are going there, if it's a grocery store, we're going there as customers, but people who are spending the most time there are the workers, yep, who I assume are not informed of any legacy of industrial work.
We would assume so, right? Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, one of the, we've addressed this, we've approached this project from a sort of a risk perspective and an inequality perspective. But you could also approach it from an economic point of view, right? These facilities, when they're active, are presumably providing jobs to a community, and they're the source of decent jobs. And as you said, the commercial facilities, the commercial firms that replace them are doing the same thing. So there's a jobs and economic development part of this story. It's not the part we tell, but it's an important part of the story. And I will say that Tom Marlowe, the graduate student who's working with me on the Rhode Island piece, is doing this for his dissertation. He is attending to those very questions. So thank you for that. Yeah. Michelle?
I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, and I think it can give a lot of us, oops, sorry. Thank you for the work that you do and for giving a lot of us ideas about kind of thinking about the areas where we live. I'm actually more curious about if you could talk a little bit more about what happened when you went to go take pictures of these places, and if you ran into people and kind of what their questions were and their responses are to I'm assuming you mentioned what you were doing. And same thing if you've presented this to anybody in some of the places that you're studying, kind of what their responses have been.
Yeah, so I will say that I was not playing the role of an ethnographer in this project. We had to find 100 sites in a matter of a couple of days in each of these cities, so we were rushing. We were stopped by police a couple of times in certain neighborhoods who, didn't understand why we were trolling around a neighborhood very slowly in a white rental car sedan. That happened in a couple of places. And then there were a couple of instances where we were asked to leave, so I don't have fun, happy stories about engaging community residents, I'm afraid. Maybe next time. And in terms of like the community stuff, I haven't, when I conducted this work, I didn't live in any of these cities, so I have not presented, but Jim, when he was at Oregon, presented this work for urban planners in Portland, and I think there was great interest in it. I will also say that the data we've collected for Rhode Island, the Department of Environmental Management and Department of Health in Rhode Island are very interested and actively engaged with us in projects to identify potential historical sources of PFAS contamination in the city. And these are the class of chemicals that are emerging as a major problem for water contamination in the US. That coincidentally began to be used in industrial production processes in the 1950s, right when our data collection began. So we were able to track down dozens of manufacturing facilities in Providence and the surrounding area, and DOH used our data to sample wells and water treatment facilities. So we're engaged at the government level. I will also say that we're in the process of building an interactive website to make this data publicly available, and there will be an app associated with the website and a crowdsourcing capacity. So my hope is to use the data as a way to engage communities, crowdsource sort of stories and story mapping projects with communities, and use it as an organizing tool to help people, build safer, more sustainable communities. That website is in process. It should be ready in a month or so.
Thank you for this great talk. I have a question about the mechanisms of how people get exposed to the risk. So yeah. I can imagine a playground where grass has been put over a prior site, or if there's massive flooding, how chemicals would enter the water stream. But if there's a parking lot and the former building has been torn down, what's the risk there? And did you survey, did you get a sense of, were you able to track the kinds of structures that exist on these sites?
So that's a great question. So we do have that information. I haven't studied it. We've just sort of, lumped it into these large categories of commercial, vacant, residential, whatever. But we absolutely could go back and sort of describe, and we have photographic evidence for all these sites as well. So we could go back and sort of map out, specifically what kind of structures occur. So we don't know anything about risk and exposure risk. And it's, we've thought about taking this project deeper and actually using the data to go do some testing to see how many of these sites are really contaminated. And that would be a massively expensive and project that probably wouldn't answer any questions definitively, but would probably open up more questions. Our sort of academic interest in this project is really going back to basics and thinking about urban environmental change processes. And so we really think about this as the transformation of urban soils in some fashion, whether or not that's actually exposing people or not. I can't say, we simply don't know. Except I would say that, you know, we tend to think of soil as, you know, stuff goes into the soil and stays there. And that's, we know, is not true, especially in the context of climate change and increased flooding. There's lots of renewed risk for chemical transport, that saturated soils, those legacy contaminants can be mobilized and move. It's also the case that in development, you know, when you develop a property, those, you know, legacy contaminants can be re-exposed. But I don't have any empirical data about that. Yes.
Sorry, I'll pass this one to you after. So it seems like there's a broken financial assurance system in the United States. There's also here in Canada as well. And a lot of the apologetic there is related to, you know, it being a threat to entering the market for small to medium enterprises. I'm curious, you know, it seems like there might be a double burden here as well, like just in terms of the health impacts, but I'm wondering about whether taxpayers are also being heavily impacted for the reclamation of these sites.
In terms of, what, can you say more about the impact?
When these sites are being reclaimed, like and being made into new commercial sites, whether these the taxpayers, it's almost like a double burden as well, because the taxpayers are having to pay rather than the industry itself.
Property owners, new property, they call responsible parties, are responsible for the remediation costs. Now, there are, in an effort to, by making responsible parties, by making owners responsible for remediation, that has put a damper on redevelopment, right? Which is one of the reasons why we have so much blighted land, undeveloped or abandoned sites, because nobody wants to put in the money to remediate and reclaim that land. So there are programs that, federal programs and state programs to subsidize that development in certain cases. But usually, as I said before, those are large, you know, tracts of highly valuable land that's going to make a large return on investment for new property owners. So, so there is some burden on taxpayer burden on that reclamation, but it's, I don't know what fraction it is. I don't think it's that much. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, it's a very beautiful study, and the urban redevelopment which have taken place in form of mixed use after the industrial abandonment of the places. I would like to know that I was not able to see any map regarding the land use maps of all 4 cities. So there are land use maps of the cities where the land has been used for certain purposes. So we can see that your team explored certain sites. And then the regulatory offices have also mentioned some of the sites. So if given a land use maps, we can easily track down that which land was used for what purposes and what kind of permits were provided to those industries which were being impacted before. And in future, if there is a land development plan, what kind of environmental impact assessment which city required for them to build up a new establishment. So we would like light on the land use plans, development plans, which may be cross-cutting with your research.
Yeah, that's a great question. We have not looked at land use maps. I'm not sure that we, the historical maps that we, you know, thought about working with are fire insurance maps, Sanborn maps, that are very detailed, parcel specific, that go back you know, to the early part of the last century. But they're, you know, they're difficult to work with and digitize and bring in. So I haven't, and I don't know how detailed or how historical land use maps are in these cities. Are you referring to American cities or Canadian?
I refer to the American cities because each city is developed through a land use map.
Yeah.
So before we develop city, we prepare land use map, which land is supposed to be used for residential area, which land is supposed to be used for commercial area, yeah, institutionals, right, environmental, hazardous land. So there are categories.
About zoning maps.
Yeah, zoning.
Yeah.
There are zoning maps. And without zoning maps, we cannot put any industry in any other zone because these are ordinance. And government, city government follow that. And you cannot just put a house in an area where you like to put down or industry. So there is an industrial zone. So you put everything in that industrial zones based on the type of the industry. And you need to acquire a permit to put any kind of industry. Following the environmental impact or in ECC, environmental compliance certificate has to be acquired. So I'm just wonder that if those proper regulatory documents have been considered. If you find a company, does that company was based on a regulatory, or it was just mushroom it by itself?
Yeah. Okay, I understand now. Yeah. So so in the book study, we did not consult or sort of bring zoning maps and changes in zoning and zoning regulation into the equation. We are doing that now for the Providence study. What our data from this project, though, clearly show is that industrial activities occur across the urban space, irrespective of zoning. As I mentioned before, the data are quite clear, the historical data are quite clear. Heavy industrial activities are certainly concentrated in particular parts of cities, and they remain concentrated in those cities for precisely the reasons you say. Smaller industries that far outnumber the larger industrial firms do not obey those same sort of regulatory zoning boundaries. And so we see them filtering throughout the urban space. I, for one, am concerned that regulatory agencies have equated small with safe. I think that's a real problem for a number of reasons. And I will also say, I guess just in sort of follow up to this, is that part of the Rhode Island work that we're doing now that I didn't mention is that with this computational analysis or computational techniques that we've developed to extract data from historical manufacturing directories, we're also able to extract data from historical city directories. And this gives us access to retail sites that do not manufacture products, but store and sell hazardous materials. So we can track gas stations, we can track dry cleaners, we can track auto repair shops, and we're doing that now as well. So small retail firms that have tanks of hazardous material. Is that it? Okay, thanks very much for the question.
Yeah, I do think we have to really thank Scott for his retrieval of historical data out of those boxes in basements. So not only the soil retrieval, but the data as a historian. So thank you. Our next speaker is John Cartwright, who is here with us as the president of the Toronto and York Regional Labor Council. He represents 200,000 union members in every sector of the economy. A carpenter by trade, he has led numerous campaigns for social, economic, and climate justice. He is chair of the Council of Canadians, vice chair of the United Way of Greater Toronto, and co-chairs the Toronto Community Benefit Network. And there's a link in his bio to the green print for a Greater Toronto, which he is the author of for the Canadian Labour Congress, and is a very good detailed report. Today he's sharing with us his talk, Respect People, Work, Communities, Climate and Transition. So please welcome John.
There's going to be some slides there, and I don't know if I have to push anything to make this happen or not. They're there. Okay. So before I start, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on lands that Indigenous people have lived in for thousands of years, and this particular space, the treaty with the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's interesting catching the tail end of the last presentation. The labor movement in Toronto has spent the last decade fighting to defend employment lands because the speculative value for residential or retail developers is dramatic. And of course, if you lose employment lands, you lose the opportunity to have decent jobs. I don't have to tell you that we all understand that the crisis is real. Canada is warming at twice the global rate, And the evidence of that change, whether they're fires, floods, heat waves, or droughts, is getting harder to deny. And we're running out of time to make that permanent transition to a truly low carbon economy. I'm here to talk about challenges and also solutions. So I'm a carpenter by trade. I started my trade at the age of 18. And for the first decade, I worked with toxic material that was full of benzene and toluene. And as a result, I'm a cancer survivor. That material created lymphoma that was running through my bone marrow and my blood 5 years ago when that was discovered, and fortunately being able to get treatment in our fabulous public healthcare system that's got me through that at this point. But I've also been at far too many funerals of workers killed on the job, workers who've died from everything from asbestosis to cancers and leukemia because of what we work with. And you'll find that in the labor movement, many environmental activists started their journey around health and safety fights. I had the fortune to be in Paris in 2015 at the COP21. And I was in a room like this with about 300 trade unionists from around the world talking about the role of unions and workers in this struggle to turn our world around. And one of the speakers was a fellow called Ken Smith. Ken was the president of the Unifor Local of Workers in Fort McMurray at Suncor, representing over 4,000 workers in the tar sands. And people said, well, what on earth are you doing here? Surely if you're here to say climate change needs to happen, isn't that going to put your members out of a job? And how on earth will they allow you to be here and speak at this kind of a forum? And Ken told a story. And he said, imagine that you are living a good life. You've got your home on the edge of town in a forest, and you're working hard. You've got a family that you're raising, and suddenly a forest fire breaks out. And that fire comes to consume your house. And you and your wife and your 2 kids grab everything you can in your arms, and you run away from that fire. The fire pursues you until you come to a river. And at that point, you can do one of 2 things. You can throw away everything you've got in your hands and try and swim across the river. You could stand and perish. Or if you've started earlier, you could have built a bridge. People in that room were stunned by that understanding of not only the threat of climate change, but the opportunities to build bridges. There's no small irony that 1 year later, the city of Fort McMurray was being consumed by flames from a massive forest fire, and Ken Smith had to drive his family out of town to a place of refuge. When we talk about the challenges in front of our society and our economy, in our movement, we say there's 3 issues to be addressed. There's a jobs crisis, a crisis of real decent jobs with wages and sustainability and permanence that people can count on. There's a crisis of environmental degradation and the looming tipping point of our world. And there's an equity crisis. In Greater Toronto, half of us are born outside of Canada, half of us are people of color. The recent stats about the racialization of poverty shows us that the income inequality has a dramatic racial side to it. And for our perspective, you cannot have a solution that does not answer all those 3 questions. So our Labor Council has been around since 1871. That's 148 years. And we started with a very small group of people saying we need more than just the wages we can bargain at our workplace. We actually need to figure out justice for our families and our communities. And that was defined as social and economic justice. After the Second World War, when people had seen the horrors of the Holocaust and the realities of colonialization, Jewish and Black trade unionists got together in Toronto and created the Toronto Joint Labor Committee on Human Rights. And they challenged the day-to-day reality of anti-Black racism, of discrimination, of anti-Semitism. They went into workplaces, they went into hotels and apartments and bars and restaurants and challenged the hard reality of the discrimination that existed. And therefore, we added racial justice into the core work of the labor movement in Greater Toronto. Well, about 30 years ago, we came to understand that we had another thing to do as a movement of people, and that was to start thinking about climate justice. And in a city that, since the First Nations gave us the name Toronto, which has been built by immigrants and refugees and their descendants, climate justice has many facets to it. I want to cast my mind back to standing on the shores of the Mediterranean 2 years ago in Barcelona and seeing a post there with numbers on the top, 3057, and these were like a sports board, the numbers would change. And underneath that, in Catalan, in Spanish, and in English, it explains these are not numbers. These are the people who've drowned in the Mediterranean this year trying to reach our shores. Barcelona has always been a city of the Mediterranean and a city of refuge. We demand a safe and legal passage for those fleeing famine and war to come to our shores. Signed, the city of Barcelona. Now, I say that because there will be many, many more climate refugees in our world. And we cannot talk about climate justice without understanding migration. There's an amazing poet, Sami, forget her last name, who has a line that says, you have to understand, nobody puts their children into a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Those are the realities that we have to talk about when we're imagining a climate justice agenda. Now, how do I do this thing? So, there we are. So I was lucky enough 30 years ago to work with a fellow called Jack Layton. He was a city councillor. He was one of the best green thinkers in our city and in fact in Canada. And we started working on programs for the city of Toronto to move towards low carbon, to think about energy efficiency, to do things which at that point in time were called crazy, a deep lake water cooling, to be able to provide air conditioning for all of our major downtown buildings. And it was a time of optimism. The Kyoto had happened. There was something called the Blue-Green Alliance creating in the States between Sierra Club and the steelworkers, saying we can have green jobs, incredible optimism. And we thought we were on a trajectory towards solving these problems. And then something else happened. After the financial collapse of 2008, a whole number of new political forces started a counterattack against the consensus on climate that was eventually reached in Paris. And those were the billionaires running coal and petroleum and mining empires that funded Donald Trump and numerous right-wing political candidates across this entire world. And in some places, they're joined by land speculators. Here, Ontario Proud, a right-wing populist group, was funded by Mattamy Homes and Merit Contractors Association, and in other places, agribusiness, as in Brazil. And they refuse to acknowledge the reality of environmental racism or the intense degradation of land and water. Instead, those oil lobbyists here have crafted a narrative that Canada must get resources to tidewater. Just think about that. Not we want to dig up the dirtiest energy in the world in the tar sands, but Canada must get resources to tidewater, or it's a betrayal of the people of Alberta. Stunning political narrative that they've created. And their success is highlighted by the fact that Justin Trudeau, the star of COP21, has now bought Trans Mountain Pipeline to take that dirtiest energy to be exported to Asia. And the narrative of these people goes back to something traditional that coal miners were told back 30 and 40 years ago. If there's going to be environmental regulations, you're going to be out of a job. Construction workers, auto workers, everybody was told that. If we're going to have environmental regulations, you're going to be out of a job. Well, the labor movement at a global scale has an answer for that proposition. And the answer is this: there are no jobs on a dead planet. There are no jobs on a dead planet. And so for the economic interests that want us to hide our heads in the sand and go along with their approach to economics, we're just saying, no, that's the wrong approach. But we are talking about transition, and we understand it's going to happen. There's a saying, another saying in our movement, that transition is assured, but justice is not. And we witnessed the hollowed out communities in the poverty wage jobs. And there's examples from past economic restructuring all over the world, but also from today's disruptive technologies. You don't have to look farther than the impact of Uber on taxi drivers in Toronto or taxi drivers in any part of the world. In fact, the tar sands, the biggest threat to jobs in the tar sands right now is automation. And in Ken Smith's local union, there will be almost 1,000 jobs lost to automated trucks being introduced into that project in these next 2 years, far more than Greta Thunberg will ever do to the impact of those work. Now, we look at this conversation and say a couple of things. If this is only something led by the elites like the Clintons or the Trudeaus, we're going to lose. It has to be a conversation amongst working people in order to stop the rise to right-wing populism. Years ago, when we were negotiating employment equity, people know what that means, that if you've got a traditional workforce and it doesn't look like your population, you need to take steps to bring in people into that work, often women, indigenous people, people of color, newcomers. And there's always been a sense of uncertainty and dislocation in anything like employment equity. And one of my good friends, Pat Case, who led the equity work on our school board and the Ontario Human Rights Commission, has said that if you want working people to accept employment equity, there's two things that they got to feel. One is they have to feel secure in their own job, and secondly, you have to feel respected by the people running their operation. Because if they feel insecure or disrespected, and you tell them their world is going to change and somebody else different is going to step in, you will have a backlash. And when we are building the concept of just transition, which is now being embraced more and more across this world, it's really important that workers feel respected and that there's some security to not only their work, but also what's going to happen to their communities. This year, Canada's Just Transition Task Force issued its report calling for a phase out of coal in 4 provinces in Ontario, while supporting the affected workers and their communities. That's going to be hard stuff. My grandfather was a coal miner, and his father before him, and father before him, and father before him. There was 1 million men underground in Britain a century ago. Today, there's a few thousand. But cities and towns have been left as ghost towns. And workers and working communities will not accept that. They'll rather vote for Trump or Ford or anybody else if you tell them that's the only option. We know it's going to take hard work, but here's where I want to start talking about solutions. So 40 years ago, there was an ongoing crisis in our workplaces. It was called workplaces accidents and deaths. But business said, that's just the cost of doing business. That's just how it's going to be. Union activists, health and safety activists, and there was only a few at the start, started saying, this is wrong, we need to find ways to fight it. They challenged the accepted norm of workplace accidents and deaths. We confronted employers and politicians. We had to educate our members. We had to fight for regulations. We teamed up with scientists and medical professionals to prove that that beautiful white paste that pipe fitters put on the pipe to cool down so after they welded, it wouldn't shrink so quickly and split. That stuff called asbestos was actually going to kill them. That the contact cement that I was using full of toluene was something that was wrong. That people should have the right to refuse unsafe work. And yeah, we found some enlightened employers to validate that if you wanted to plan a health and safety agenda on work, it would actually be a better thing. And today, as a result of the laws we put in place, the training we put in place, the transformation of work, we have reduced accidents and fatalities in Ontario to one of the lowest jurisdictions in the world. That can be done if people have a plan and have a strategy. Here's another experience that I've had. In the 1990s, after the real estate industry collapsed all across the Western world, with the Reichmans in particular and Canary Wharf and all through Toronto, there was not a single commercial high-rise being built east of the Rockies. I was the head of the Building Trades Council. 30–40% of our members were out of work. There were people losing their homes, there were breakups, there were suicides. We were desperate for work. We sat down with people in Toronto City Council and said, can we find a way to use the skills of our unemployed members to do something that is good for the climate and for the economy? And we created a government-run program called the Better Buildings Partnership. We went into the buildings, the high-rise commercial and residential buildings that were designed in the 50s when they were energy pigs, energy was cheap, power meant nothing. And said to those owners, we can reduce your cost by 30, 40, or 50% by doing a full deep retrofit of your buildings, and it will not cost you a penny. Not cost you a penny. The energy service company will raise the money, they'll do the audit, they'll bring in the contractors, the skilled tradespeople, they'll retrofit it. You will just continue to pay the same price for your gas and electricity you would have had for 3.14 years or 4.2 years, depending on the audit. And at the end of that point in time, everything's gone, and now you've got a dramatically reduced cost. That, when we started talking to the program about with our members, they said, this is too good to be true. This is a bunch of granola crunching green nonsense. How will this ever make a difference? I need a job now. Let's keep paving the suburbs. But when we put thousands of people back to work, and apprentices who were stopped in their time were now able to finish their trade, suddenly people became true believers. Since that program started, we created 45,000 person years worth of work in one program and reduced CO2 emissions by 680,000 tons. That's real progress. That's telling ordinary people that you can have a job in a better economy. And we came out of that exercise understanding that we could take our knowledge and our skills and build green buildings, and we could advocate for green building standards as the City of Toronto created. We could advocate for engineers and architects to understand how to design those buildings, because the tradespeople in Toronto are very highly unionized and very highly skilled. We can build whatever you want. We can build the same business as usual schlock that will continue to contribute to the problem. Or, you know, we work from blueprints, or we can build stuff to green prints, which will be net zero carbon buildings and urban planning that makes sense. Here's another example. Our municipal workers, the solid waste guys, the blue collar people driving the garbage trucks. Over a decade ago, they went to the city and said, you know, there's all of this organic waste being thrown out. That's crazy. Goes into landfill. We don't have enough landfill. Why don't we divert organic waste into a separate stream and turn it into compost? And the powers that be said, well, this sounds like a union plot for more jobs, and we don't believe this is something that's worthwhile. People would never underdo that. So they said no, because they had a plan to take millions of tons of garbage in Toronto and put it up into a lake in Northern Ontario called Adams Mine. Well, the CUPE and our Labour Council and the Indigenous people in the North and residents in the North fought that stupid plan, stopped it, and then the city had to have a task force to say, what do we do now? And a year and a half later, the task force came back with a recommendation that was exactly what CUPE had proposed in the first place. 95% of homeowners were happy to put the organics in their green bin. And today, Toronto, that's a huge advantage, the City of Toronto, the landfill not being filled. And it was something that Union Movement had proposed, working with our environmental allies. We took those examples and said, why don't we craft a full strategy for a full green economy in the city? And in fact, in the country. And I helped to work with the auto workers, steel workers, pulp and paper workers, retail workers, and others to create in 1999 a green job strategy for the Canadian Labour Congress. It was the first major central labor body in the world that endorsed a full green job strategy in 1999. We then built on that. In our schools in 2002, there was an eco-schools program created to try and move education into a greenest space possible. And we started to create forums where we traded these concepts with community leaders, particularly from diverse communities, our trade unions, and our environmental friends. And in 2009, we had a Good Green Jobs for All seminar that had 600 people in it. And it was very interesting because my friends in the environment movement, I was talking to one of them the next day from Ottawa, and they said, how was it? I said, good. Go and take a look at the pictures, because it's going to look a lot different than any environmental conference you've ever seen, because almost half of us in that room were people of color, talking about how to change this world, where the environmental movement in Canada, much of the world, has been pretty white up to that point in time. When we're talking about moving to a green economy and prosperity, it has to be a shared prosperity. So we've also negotiated employment equity in major infrastructure programs. We negotiated with Metrolinx for the mass transit program across Eglinton that a percentage of that work in the trades would go to young people from diverse communities, women, Indigenous people, newcomer communities going into the trades. But guess what? I then got challenged by my union sisters saying, so John, 90-something% of construction work is for men. So this is about jobs for the boys, eh? That's what you've negotiated. I thought you were an equity champion. So we went back to the drawing board and realized for every 2 people on a construction site, there's somebody in an office doing the design, the technical, the finance, the clerical. And for the first time in North America, in one of these programs, we negotiated a career path for the white-collar, professional, admin, and technical positions for newcomer graduates, for newcomer communities, and for internationally trained professionals. And when they said, what should our goal be? We said, we don't know. It's never been done before. If 50 people got a job through this in those communities, equity-seeking communities, that would be a success. Well, last month we got the report. There's now 150 people who've got jobs in the white-collar stream. That's as many as we have in construction trades. So we're actually negotiating good green jobs across all sectors. 2015, the LEAP Manifesto came out. Has anybody here heard of the LEAP Manifesto? Some of you and Canadians, I'd urge you to take a look at LEAP Manifesto and see what it lays out. Naomi Klein, brilliant author, helped put that together. I was one of the first union signatories in Canada for that. It challenged us about how to transition our economy for jobs with equity there. In Paris in 2001, I spent a lot of time in the industries expos watching the technology and the advances in technology. And the one place that I found most interesting was a French glass company. And the fellow behind the booth wasn't French, he was English. I said, well, what are you doing here? He said, well, our facility is the most energy efficiency of any facility in the 20 countries this company works in. I said, well, how did that happen? I explained who I was. And he said, well, really, it's because the unions in Britain negotiated an environmental rep, workplace rep, 3 or 4 years ago. That rep is somebody I work with. And when we talk about improving efficiency, they know that there's a commitment that if we get more efficiency in this plant, it doesn't mean somebody's going to be laid off. It means somebody will be reassigned to find out even more efficiencies in energy. And that's how we've done that, jointly collaborating with labor and management to understand the process of where we're going. So we've created, coming back from Paris, we decided we wanted to create a labor contribution to how we move as a society to greener jobs. We say there's going to be 3 roles that people need to pick up. A role of green leaders, whether they're on the corporate side and the political side and the union side, a role of green advocates, people who take knowledge and advocate for those change, and a role of green teachers. And you can figure out which of those roles you want to pick up, which of those hats you want to put on. But each of those are fundamentally essential. Within that context of just transition, it has now become something that's in the COP Accords. It's moved from a preamble into the main body because more and more people, as they've seen the rise of the right across Europe, have recognized that we need to have people buying into this process. It's a long-term commitment from all of society because the goal of resilience is not just for physical spaces, but also for social infrastructure. That'll be tested by storms, droughts, wildfires, and yes, the migration of climate refugees. Listen, the reality is that corporate power is going to have to be challenged and curtailed if we want to do this. This is not going to be a Marquis of Queensberry conversation. Big oil, big mining, big resources have dirty money, and they're determined to defend it at all costs, and there will be a political fight, as people talk about, in the same degree as the Brave New Deal in the United States challenged the corporate world of the day, or the Second World War challenged people to take resources and use them dramatically different to stop fascism. Long-term planning, focused investment, and deep respect for workers and their communities are core to creating the world that we want to live in. I thank you very much for your attention.
Questions, comments?
Somebody back there, yeah?
Behind you?
Amazing talk. It really, it's a really paradigm smashing talk. And my father was a miner, and father, tin, coal, tunnel mining, the London Underground. And it was just very, very interesting how you sort of weaved a lot of that I suppose labor narrative that seems at some point that especially those in the fossil fuel industries can seem like the sort of the bad guys or the bad people, you know, and you seem to really sort of, you know, smash that paradigm very powerfully. Just this morning, I was, you know, we heard about Greta Thunberg talking in Alberta and some protest by oil and gas workers against her. And it made me sad because I know that I'll have many, many progressive friends who will demonize those sort of workers, you know, and how, you know, in a way you're saying about automation is the real enemy here. The special interest groups, the real enemy. How do, like someone like myself, how would I challenge friends in the progressive movement not to, in a way, demonize those workers? But, you know, how do you stop that whole, you know, paradigm being created and move beyond it?
Well, I think, you know, respect is something that people earn. And the people who worked in those old economies that powered the prosperity that the Western world, you know, got, some of it taken from the global South, but some of it from the people in the mines or running oil, will say, we were the ones who made the economy that you now benefit from. How can you demonize us? You didn't mind turning on the power to run your computer when it was run by coal or run by oil or run by gas. But you're saying we should be out of a job. So the fundamental thing to understand is that respect for what working people do is crucial. There's a huge element of class prejudice if it's blue collar work. But guess what? White collar workers are finding the same level of precarity today that the itinerant construction workers, why we call us journeymen, we finish a job, we're out of a job, and then we journey to another site. So having the conversation about that is really important. And it's not about charity. So Ken Smith, the reason he could say that powerfully, because he was a zinc miner in New Brunswick, and the zinc ran out, and his community had no choice but to move or be on welfare. And so when he understands the boom bust of any economy, any resource-based economy, he could speak from truth to his fellow workers in the oil sands, right? I think highlighting the personal reality of people. I mean, this fellow that I've got up here, he is a roofer. He's a member of my union, Local 27. We have the highest level of unionization in North America in construction here because we had some tough fights. But he was happy to have that quote attributed to him because he knows he's got the skills to build stuff. And if you want him to build a net zero building, be happy to do that. But if the only thing on offer is more suburban sprawl, he's got to feed his family. Or she has to live in a community housing and wants people to come and retrofit it, wants the young people in community housing to get those opportunities. So building that respectful dialogue about the world of working people and the journey we've all been in. And by the way, I was just in Manchester this August for 200th anniversary of Peterloo. And so as we think about those journeys for democracy as well, this is also a struggle for democracy in the real sense of working people being able to shape their future, not the economic elites determining and undermining our ability to shape that.
Thanks. Some things that resonated with me that you talked about was that we need a solution that addresses all of these So I'm wondering how you feel in terms of precarious employment and perhaps having this industry collaboration. Because we see a lot of people who are facing barriers to employment who are trying to get into apprenticeship programs, but because of the need to be on call, and the need to also feed your family, that you're not able to get those apprenticeship hours that you need in order to get your red seal?
Well, in Ontario, we have most of our apprenticeship programs are jointly overseen by labor and management. And what they try and do is look at the workforce needs in the year or two coming up and try and balance the number of people that are coming into the apprenticeship so that the market's not flooded and people are wondering, when can I possibly get the next call because there's 10 other people knocking at that door. We have, my home local has over 2,000 apprentices in them. The electricians local in Toronto has almost 2,000 locals. The pipe fitters local, that by the way has had a geothermal in its training center for the last 15 years. They have almost 2,000 apprentices. So there's lots of young people coming in. The question is, how do you balance that? Yeah. And we are also challenging our contractors through the community benefits program to say you can't just take people who look like your foreman's nephew and brother. We have to be able to ensure that communities that have not been involved in construction have those opportunities. There is systemic racism in our world. It's a reality. But you know what? There is no seniority in construction. I can work for a company for 30 years, and Joan can be hired yesterday, and I can be laid off today with 1 hour notice, and I have no grievance. You keep your job in construction by being productive. And it's very tribal in certain ways. So building an employment equity process into that is really crucial. We have a Sisters in Trades group to help women that are in the trades that face the reality of, sexism that's part of the world, and so they can sustain that. And we have mentoring programs for young Black youth, women and men coming into our trades in Toronto. I can't say that's the same across all of Canada. Ironically, in Alberta, the right-wing governments that are pushing oil all over the place are the same governments that smashed our unions in 1984 and cut wages in half. So sometimes we have to remind our own constituents that the people who are driving this agenda of politics of division based on race, origin, religion, the people who are driving the agenda against climate justice are also the people who actually want to drive a race to the bottom on wages and conditions so they can maximize profit. It is a tough reality that we have to talk about out loud.
Just a quick question. You'd spoken about the union workers sort of voting against their self-interest. So how do you convince union workers to vote for the long term rather than the short term?
It's the same as all Canadians. We talk about there can be jobs with justice. You can have actually a future with great careers. And it's not just in construction. And in the green print, if you get a chance to look at it, you'll see traditionally everybody says, oh, it's about energy, where the energy comes from, the movement of people and goods and buildings. We've added workplaces in there. There's a role to have the similar process that I talked about, that glass factory, in everything from hospitals to hotels to universities. And by the way, our unions at the U of T have tried to bargain climate representatives, and the university management has delayed and delayed and delayed, and they have not invited an appropriate equal-sided labor management environment committee the way that we've won at the Toronto School Board. So when we give people the, what's that famous expression? You could say that, I couldn't possibly comment. But it is about showing, folks of color who've come here desperate for a world, a better world, and have got a university degree and want to use that in engineering or advertising or communications. There's a place for you in advocating, leading, or teaching about what a sustainable economy looks like. And without that hope, if all we do is describe the problems, people just say, man, I got 2 jobs to do. I got to try and think about a family, putting a roof over my head. I'm not going to be there. We've got to, courage and hope are pretty goddamn important things in this conversation.
I'm wondering if you know if any of your colleagues in Alberta are working on just transition related to the tar sands.
Yes, in fact, the Alberta Federation of Labor is working with the Blue-Green Alliance, which is the steelworkers. They represent many of the coal miners there, and the IBW represents some of the coal thermal generation. And they've created their own document on just transition, and many of those things have been picked up by the federal government's Just Transition report. It's a report that, depending on the outcome next Monday, will be supported, where communities will be transitioned off coal, but they won't be left as ghost towns. You know, and that's the important thing. If you go to Wawa, Ontario, the iron mine shut down, and now that, you know, the two big hotels in town are boarded up. So those unions in the Alberta Federation of Labor have given a lot of thought to that, because they've also seen the boom bust, right? It has not always been a boom in Alberta. A whole lot of my colleagues, my workmates in the early 80s went out to Alberta, and bang, suddenly they were unemployed in 84 and 85. And there's been another recession since then. So they know that a sustainable economy is not about putting all eggs in one basket. And there's another group called Iron and Earth, which are tradespeople who are saying, we know how to build that stuff, the refinery, the crackers, and those and pipelines. Why can't we build alternative energy and take the same amount of money doing wind and solar and geothermal and transit and build those? So there's very good body of thought there by the labor movement. The people that are there protesting against Greta are all businessmen, are all truck driving, self-employed businessmen, basically, and funded by the Conservative Party, and ultimately funded by big oil and some of those supporters.
Thank you very much.
There's one more question. There's one person probably got no question.
Thank you for allowing me. Thank you for a great presentation and courage and hope. I see most of your work is practical and real. Do you have anything on policy per se, targets, how strategies to revise policies?
Yes, if you go to laborcouncil.ca climate, you will see statements on climate emergency. You will see these shareables. We're taking these in order to popularize that there are solutions. You'll see the green print. You will see some of the work on just transition. I was asked by one of the organizations that provides information for the United Nations to do a piece on just transition. That's there. You'll see a number of elements of that work, including from the International Trade Union Confederation. So across this world, we're trying to figure this stuff out. We know we have to stop the rise of right-wing politics, because that's about the politics of division and hate. And fundamentally, it's the politics will cripple the ability of humankind to come up with the solutions that are so important for us.
Thank you very much.
Oh, swag.
Swag.
Thank you.
And to Scott. Thank you very much. Have given us, opened our day with a lot of food for thought. So to generate and keep percolating